Okay, hello everyone. We're pleased to see you all today, and I hope you'll enjoy our presentation. My name is Larissa, and today we'll speak about illegitimate data protection requests to delete or to address. I am a data protection lawyer and a data protection officer, and also a PhD researcher at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, School of Law. And this is also the topic of my research. Now, I'm presenting today with Mark. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. Good morning, all. I'm Mark Povey. I'm the Technical Director at JS Information Governance Limited, and I'm also the Chief Data Protection Officer for the organisation. So, back to Larissa. Thank you.
Thank you. So, to begin with, privacy. What exactly is privacy? How can we intertwine privacy, data protection, and security? First of all, privacy and data protection are not synonyms, as confusions may arise. Many people use them as synonyms, but they are not in reality. Privacy is a much bigger concept and, of course, more generic. But also, both data protection and privacy overlap with security. So I think everyone in the room knows, or at least is aware, that there's a lot of personal data that's being sold on dark web. This is the unfortunate truth, but this is an example where privacy intertwines with security, because that's also a security problem, some data leakages or data breaches, perhaps. So to continue, I'd like to refer to a metaphor used by the European Parliament in 2020 that I think is very insightful, that data is the new oil. Now, you perhaps have heard this metaphor before, but the thing is that it's not totally accurate, because data is infinite, whereas oil is not, unfortunately, again. So there may be other metaphors that may be more suitable, such as data as the water. And that is because for both data and water, we need regulations so that we know how to impose some restrictions, how to respect those restrictions, and how to make the good itself, so be it water or data, go and flow from the origin to the destination lawfully. So what's the relevance? One may ask, why is it such a big fuss to discuss and to consider how we cope with something that's infinite? There are three main points about the relevance. First of all, that there's an evolution, there's a shift into how people perceive personal data. And when I say people, that's natural persons, that's both the data subject, so how we perceive our own personal data, but also how cyber perpetrators perceive personal data, because it's gaining more and more economic value. At the same time, because of the digitalization process, of course, there are more cyber crimes. So again, coming back to the economic value, that has been a target and a goal for cyber crimes as well. And last but not least, we need to understand why personal data is relevant, because as organizations, we need to comply with some rules. If there are no legal requirements, it would be a chaos. So, what are these legal obligations? As a lawyer, I can tell you, and probably you have encountered this in daily life as well, there are many situations in which there are different layers of regulations or of legislation that overlap. So we would have international and regional legal obligations. For example, for the international ones, we have Convention 108 that refers to automatic processing of personal data, and at the regional level, we would have the General Data Protection Regulation, the most famous and well-known one, and maybe NIS2 directive, which I'm sure you have heard about, because this is about network information security, and it's also gaining a lot of fuss lately. The second layer would be the national legal obligations. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Data Protection Act 2018. We would also have the Computer Misuse Act 1990. And the latter one refers more to cybersecurity incidents, to data breaches, and it presents a more criminal aspect of this incident, but there may be different names for these laws, such as BSI Act in Germany, or a Data Protection Act somewhere else, or Organic Law in Spain, and so on and so forth. Now, the last point of this introductory section is the GDPR references, and this is what we'll use throughout the presentation. So the most important principle for you as security practitioners and people interested in security as well is confidentiality and integrity. And this one is also called the security principle. Now, of course, we know confidentiality and integrity are two attributes that we should maintain to data as an asset. But it's not only that. So again, you as people interested and experienced with security, you will know the acronym CIA. But what's very interesting at this overlapping with GDPR is that in the GDPR, we don't have only CIA. We have CIAR, and not many people know that, because we are very focused on security or very focused on privacy, and we sometimes omit, they meet, and they even have some differences. So this CIAR refers to resiliency, so how we make sure that if the server breaks down or something happens, we are able to restore the data. However, there's also the accountability principle. And when we talk about accountability, that means we need to be able to prove compliance and to demonstrate that we documented all our decisions. And the thing with accountability is that many organizations disregard this principle, although in case of an investigation or a data breach, it's one of the principles that's mostly combined with other principles. So it will be a data breach because we had not respected integrity and confidentiality, but neither we respected accountability. So now, Mark will continue with the operational measures and the organizational ones.
So, organizational measures, technical measures, and all of these other things you can see on the board. One of the first things that we're going to talk about is FRIEND, or FOI. What does that mean? So if we're working for public bodies, we have a thing called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. Sometimes they're misrecognized and treated as different things. Or is it actually a friendly request? Can we understand it? Is it going to be a request that embodies something else? And we'll come on to that. Operational measures. What level of access restrictions have we got in place? Are we definitely working along the least privilege? When somebody leaves the organization, are we making sure that we clear up everything behind them, everything's locked down, they haven't got access left at the end of it? What is our incident response like? Are we making sure that everybody that's responded in that knows what to do? So they identify the incident, raise the issues, and act upon it. What is our disaster recovery plan? Have we checked it? Have we worked it? Are we absolutely sure that if something goes wrong, we can recover quickly and we can make sure that the data has been protected at source? And that brings me on to operational measures again, talking about encryption. Is our data always encrypted? i.e., when it's at rest, when it's sat on our servers, it's sat in the cloud. And one that gets missed quite often, is that data encrypted when it's in transit? Because we've all experienced, I'm sure, or heard about the man-in-the-middle attack. If the data's encrypted, the man in the middle, unless other things are achieved, it will actually prevent some of that happening. Is validated ID being used if we're being sent requests, such as a DSAR? Are we just taking it on face value, or are we checking that the person who's making that request is the person he or she purports to be? Have we got prior verification steps in place? Do we know who they are because they were an account holder at a bank, for example, so we can validate backwards if needs be? So have we, therefore, within our organization, really established clear roles and responsibilities? And that has been done throughout the organization. We haven't just woken in, coming to work one morning, and lo and behold, we've been made to the new CTO, the new CISO. We've got the new head of IT support without actually having established what they are, what they need to do, who they need to report to, and do they actually understand what the role is? Have we got solid frameworks in place which support data security, things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, NIST 2, we were talking to somebody outside the hall, and many others? If they're in place, did we do it as a paper exercise, or have we gone through the whole, this is what we now need to do. This is your responsibility. You have to take personal responsibility as well as organizational responsibility. I don't think that gets spoken about enough. So we have to make sure that the people that we're expecting to be able to do this job have got proper training. They haven't gone through a tick box. I recognize this, ding, 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 thank you very much, you are now trained. What's their awareness? Can their awareness be proved? If not, why not? What measures are you putting in place to establish that? And what measures are our operators, our clients, our data management team, what are they doing to make sure those organizational measures are in place and are being acted upon? They need to be checked. We can't just say yes. So, data protection by privacy and design. So what does that mean? So data privacy by design, data protection by design. Have your systems gone through a rigorous process that people are definitely allowed to access the data? They're definitely allowed to process the data in a particular way. Is that being logged? Are we making sure that we only process data for the means for which it's being obtained and for the period for which it's obtained? And then that has been logged, actually put in place. We've got appropriate measures to reflect on that. And we know, through records and everything else, that those persons are authorized. And indeed, what that means is we are looking after the rights and freedoms of the natural person. Because if we can't, even if we haven't had a data breach, we can still be fined and punished by the relevant supervisory authorities and others because we have created, in effect, a regulatory breach. So we have to be able to establish that. So the privacy by design has to be in place. By default, so we've got to always implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. And again, it's by default. So the CEO is saying to the CISO and his or her security team, I don't want you to do that, it's going to take too long. No, it has to be in place by default. Because if it goes wrong and something happens, you have a data breach, you have an unlawful activity around that data, somebody leaves the building with the data because they've moved on, they've put it all on a USB stick, and the appropriate measures weren't in place, because the CEO has blocked that effort to make that unable to carry out, he or she can be held personally accountable. And Larissa is going to talk about accountability in a little while. So we've got to make sure that the purpose of the processing is legitimate and is actually under a legal basis. Therefore, data privacy by default. So, back to Larissa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, the premise of today's presentation, now that we went through all the introduction and the legal background and more boring part, we now dive into what's more interesting, the premise. That is one study from 2019 that was presented at Black Hat USA from James Paver. So he presented in his research that when you send data subject access requests, which we'll refer to as DSARs throughout the presentation, you can skip sometimes the security checks. And that is one of his main highlights of the study. So this study was carried out on over 150 organizations across US, UK mainly. And what he found out was that across the organizations that unlawfully complied with the request, 70% were mid-sized organizations, so which is the majority, I would suppose, from this conference as well. Whilst the larger organizations would follow exactly the law, would respect all the legal requirements, and the smaller organizations, they would ignore the requests, which is a huge question mark, even in terms of how we really enforce the regulations. So there is a legal lacuna, basically, because the GDPR allows you to reject this request if you didn't confirm the identity, but that's not the case. Because if you didn't check the identity, you can't decide whether it's confirmed or not. You just skip through that because perhaps you forgot about it or you just didn't adhere to the regulations. So there are some knowledge constraints and also some operational limitations. So what can organizations legally do? You can reject this kind of requests that may seem illegitimate or are, in fact, illegitimate if they are manifestly unfounded or excessive. Now, that's a very good question that will probably pop up in your mind. When do we know if a request is manifestly unfounded or excessive? First of all, what is manifestly? Now, if we go to a dictionary, it would say something evident, something obvious. But would that mean, in turn, that if the request is not obvious to be excessive, then we can't reject it? Now, that's a question, of course, it's an open question. We don't really know the answer right now because there's much uncertainty around how we apply this provision and how we cope as organizations with this kind of requests. There is no clear definition, not in the EU, not in the implementation laws, and perhaps from what we check, not even outside the EU. So this is why James Pavur also concluded that this provision is rather focused on spending and wasting the resources of the organization and not really on the malicious intent. Now, we would take this a step further, and that's because we had a client that encountered this situation in real life, and it's a very innovative way of attacking via DSARs. So, you can see now on the screen that I sent Mark a DSAR, which I often do, but he doesn't really respond. Please find attached my DSAR, Mark. And I would tell him to open it, of course, very kind, very polite, but that's an executable file. So that's the first lesson you should take from today, that you should look into the format of the file, because if it's executable, who would really send a request, like a formal request to an organization in an executable file? The trick is that the regulation is in favor of this in a way, so they protect this kind of attack. And that is because there's no limitation in terms of how you send this request, the format, again. So as an organization, you can't say, I reject your request because it's in an executable file and I only accept PDFs and text files or whatever. You can't do that. So, of course, the person will try to insist, please look over the document, please let me know if you have questions, and so on and so forth. And you, as the organization, you may feel the pressure that there is a request there, that you know you have a deadline, although the deadline doesn't say execute it immediately, respond to it immediately. There's no such thing. So you would let the panic take over you, and you would just click it to see, what's this request about? What does this girl or this guy want? However, this goes even further. What if the request is actually in a PDF file? That seems very innocent. There's nothing to go wrong there, right? It's wrong. Even if it's a PDF, there can be hashed text, there can be obfuscated text that may skip through the inspection techniques. So that means you may have some malware attached even if it looks like a PDF. So this one is a bit more formal. It also has some legal references which may trick you even more that this is a very, very legitimate request. So now that we established how these attacks would look, of course you will probably ask, what are the vulnerabilities in my organization? How can this actually happen? Mark, would you like to point this out?
So, we've all talked at length throughout this event about cyber vulnerabilities across all the different stores we've seen. But we still have shared email, and we will often, as best practice, we believe we will have a shared email address that we share with your great unwashed out there on the other side of the internet. Email your DSARs, your right to be forgotten, etc., to dpo@da.com. And that should only be really going to one person or one team. And it should be monitored. It can't just be left, because these requests are time sensitive. Yes, we can extend them, but that's under certain situations. And the data protection officer's email, it should really only go to the privacy team, as I said. And the data protection officer and his or her team, they're the guardians of the organization. They're there to make sure that these things don't get through if they are malicious intent. So they work with the IT security team, with the CISO. Quite often we find that the DPO, although it's a very important role, they're parked in a little corner. Do not disturb until something goes wrong. Well, in reality, the DPO is really there to make sure things don't go wrong. And then also, again, with the security team, with all the guys out here, how are access controls set up and how can they prevent data breaches via email? We encounter it, we call it the Friday afternoon error. There's a rush. Got to get these responses out. I'm going to send this response. I need to get it out. The CEO needs it. and it's your reporting for the week, who was off sick, who was away. That actually becomes a data breach if you haven't managed it. You've sent it through a distribution list, and half the people on there aren't entitled. So the access controls have to start at the beginning, not later. Have we got the correct budgets in place to make sure we can protect against that? So remember, it's not just technology, and we're going to come on to technology, it is people. Understand the 60-second pause. Am I sending this to the right people? Am I opening this email when I should? Because unfortunately, as Larissa said, you can't enforce, you will only accept data access request, right to be forgotten, by email to dpo@da-da-da.com. They can send it by carrier pigeon if they want. So you've got to be aware, and you've got to focus on that if you are part of the security team and you're working with the data security team. There's often, again, it's a lack of inadequate training. You know, we're all painfully aware of what happened with PSNI, with the FOIA. They sent the FOIA out as they were expected to, and at the back of the FOIA there was a spreadsheet with everybody's names and address. Were the people that did that trained? Did they actually understand what FOIA meant, which is why we mentioned FOIA way back when? FOIA is different to a DSAR, but quite often you will see the request, under FOIA, I am expressing my right to access my data. Well, that's not a FOIA. A FOIA is very specific to the public sector, and health sector, and things like that. So it is a DSAR. So people get bored. GDPR, I'm afraid to say, not for me, I'm a bit odd. GDPR is quite a dry subject. So how can we make the training more appealing to those people that we're relying on? Remember, we talked about guardians. We're relying on them to help us avoid data breaches through easy channels. So we don't want to sit them with a 60-minute presentation droning on Article 5, Article 6, Article 15, Article 18. So we've got to make that more appealing, spending some time and thinking about it. And again, have we locked in an appropriate budget for that? Because if we haven't, how can we be sure that that training has prevented that vulnerability turning into a real problem? Larissa and I's favourites. I attended the AI conference last year. And they said, who here is responsible for writing policies? Me. Who here writes policies daily? Who writes policies more than, exactly, who writes more than one policy a day? Me. And unfortunately, again, it can be quite dull. And we write policies and procedures, and they're not really supported throughout the organization. We get sent a request by the CEO, write a new data privacy policy, in it comes, we sit there in a little box of our own making and write a policy. They've got to be able to be understood by people. And indeed, if they can't be understood, those policies and procedures could actually, again, lead to regulatory breach. So you've got to spend the time and actually make sure that when you bring those policies and procedures in and roll them out throughout the organization, the people that are going to have to implement and act upon those actually can. They actually understand what it means. So there are some lawyers in the room, so I will say this. If it's in legal waffle, they're not going to understand it. It's got to be clear. They've got to actually really get what that policy means, how that procedure is actually used and acted upon. Because that will then lead us to our ultimate goal, the human firewall. People who think about what they're doing. Why am I sending this email to 50 people? It's only relevant to one. Why am I clicking on that insecure link? Why have I got a smishing attack and it's Mark sent me a photograph and I'm going to click it? They have to understand why they are also part of the effort, not just somebody that's passed down to. And again, budgets always have to be correct. So, technology versus technology. What types of software should organizations check? Did anybody here attend the closing discussions last night? I did. They brought up AppSec. And again, it gets forgotten about, because what does AppSec do? It increases cost. So all of a sudden, that £50,000 rollout of some really cool technology now has an additional £20,000 on checking the actual security of the application. But that in itself is interesting, because people don't understand that a DPIA should be part of that AppSec. also part of the data privacy regulations. So what's the main criteria for understanding that? The price, any error rates, failure rates, how is that tested? How is it rolled out? And again, you need that application. How significant is it in terms of cost, and those costs that we often forget because we're too busy listening to what the salesman told us. We've done a quick demo, we've spent some time. How do you go about onboarding that properly and applying AppSec? So, for Larissa, the rationale versus impulse.
Yes, thank you. So, with the rationale and impulse, I want to briefly address three clashing notions that we have somehow touched upon the whole presentation. So the first one, of course, we can rely on the rationale and impulse one. And that means, as I pointed out previously, if you get a DSAR that may seem suspicious and you're panicking, you don't know whether you should comply, you should open the file, etc., the best thing to do is scientifically called the rational actor model. So it may sound very fancy, but what it means is that you should ask what a rational person would do. So I'm having this request. I don't know, I'm scared, I'm panicking, what a rational person would do. It depends on the type of organizations you have, the structure, and so on. The procedures, perhaps, as Mark previously said. So you can send it to security to check, to do some background digging on that request. You can scan it yourself if you have some software that was approved by the company. There are different ways, different routes you can choose from. The second layer of clashing notions would be private versus public. So what that means is that we have the GDPR, which can be summed up as public intervention. So when we have a law that was adopted, that's public intervention. But what do we do if the public intervention is not enough? We resort to private intervention. So private would mean we resort to the market. So we go to the software providers, we look for technology to counter technology. At the same time, the third layer of the clashing notions could be business interests versus social interests. And that's a very common one, but perhaps common for us, but not common for the executive committees or the leaders of the organizations. The business interest is all the time, we want to spend as little as possible, but we want to earn as much as possible. And if we want to earn a lot, we need to collect a lot of personal data. So in this case, we need to balance a bit the business interest and the social interest. We don't want to damage, we don't want to violate the rights and freedoms of the data subjects and, of course, our customers, because that would in turn change the position of our company in the market. Nobody would want to buy or to be provided with services from a company that is well known, that has data breaches, for example. So these three sets of clashing notions would particularly create the bigger picture. And this is what I think you should remember after this presentation. I think the most important one is the business interest versus social interest, because at the end of the day, we work with people, and as we said in the beginning, personal data has changed a bit in terms of how valuable it is and how people perceive it. So what are the conclusions and what you should really stick to after this presentation? Mark?
So, takeaways. Number one, apparently valid data protection requests is not always legitimate. And again, remember, data protection requests, people panic about them. There's fear around doing them incorrectly, fear around giving away the wrong data, fear around, did it go to the right person? So you've got to check. And what can that also mean is we switch it the other way, they can often be a type of attack. And there is lots of documented cases where that is happening now. You know, the dark web has woken up to the fact that people are scared of DSARs. So we, as security professionals, as data privacy professionals, we have to be aware of that. You know, we all spend loads of time understanding the latest malware, the latest ways that people are trying to egress data. It can be very simple now away. Training and company culture are just as important. And that is one that I'm really passionate about, because more often than not, companies, even though they know the dangers of things going wrong around data protection and data privacy and illegitimate data requests, it's paid no more than thumb service. They've actually got to be equally important, and that comes right down from the top. So it can't just be something that's thrown at the CISO, deal with that, I'm not interested. It literally is a CEO-level operation. He or she, or if it's multiples, have to be involved. Technology can be used against technology. So there are tools out there that will actually run as a filter. So before the email, the spreadsheet, the document, the PDF, the multiple PDFs are delivered to the requester, the software will work like our second set of eyes. It will look and check and prevent data leaks, data breaches from happening. It will stop that data leaving the building until it's been appropriately protected. So malware protection and all the stuff that we do from a day-to-day is great, and some of that has those kind of tools in it. You know, we've seen the tools that do email. Oh, your email's got this attachment in it, and it may contain personal data. Do you want to send it? Oh, no. I do want to use my technology in a manner which enables me, as an operator within the privacy realm, to process and interact with that data in the time constraints that are laid out, but also within the legal responsibilities that we have to other people that may be mentioned within that DSAR, with other people whose data may be subject to an attack because we clicked on the exe file that Larissa said. She's forever doing it, by the way. So it's all about how do we use technological solutions to fix technological problems. You know, the standard attack vectors that we're aware of, and what we're trying to say is there are others which come around from social engineering and other things as well. So, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Any questions?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, that's a bit odd.
Oh, yeah, there's one.
So if we're processing somebody's data as like a secondary kind of processor, and we've literally just got their name and, you know, I don't know, certain preferences with regards to certain things, and we get a request from them, how would we verify their identity? Because it could be a very common name, for instance.
Well, that's a good question. So are you talking about as if you're working on behalf of another company?
Yes.
So you would become what's known as a processor. So the data controller, the company whose data you are processing on behalf of them, is actually responsible for that data subject access request, first and foremost. So you could take a couple of actions. You could email them back and say, ever sorry, please speak to Mark and Larissa at da-da-da-da.com, or forward that request to the DPO at the data controller. I've had this request. You are not responsible for doing it, so you shouldn't. Okay. And that's where things can go wrong, because you know, we have a lot of data bureaus out there, and they could be in other far-flung parts of the world. They don't necessarily understand data protection, data privacy, ISOs, and all the other stuff. They just want to get those medical reports uploaded back onto the NHS site. So you shouldn't be doing it. You should just say, it's not for us. Don't read it. Don't pass it through your team. Send it to the person or persons who are responsible at the limited company, at the law firm that have hired you to do the job.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah.
So one question from me is California Privacy Protection Act, which is finally doing something about data brokers.
Yes.
Selling our data every day, every hour, every second.
Yeah.
So many people who don't understand that.
Yeah.
So I work in cybersecurity for a while.
Yeah.
But I see that everyone says security, security, security. No one understands privacy.
Absolutely.
Look into that. I'm just wondering, can you see any change coming, say, from GDPR or any other regulation who finally think about privacy of people who actually connect to internet every day?
So the connection was the connection with the CCPA then?
Is there anything coming from GDPR or any other regulation to follow what the California protection actually there is an option where someone can request all the data brokers to remove his private information, but there is no such a thing in GDPR.
There is a right to erasure, which is also called right to be forgotten. And normally, if someone submits such a request, it's a very simple one. Please delete all the data from your systems. And that would also include requesting deletion. So if you send it to a company, that company would in turn request deletion from other companies that they work with. So based on the previous question as well, if we had service providers that we work with, and these are data processors, so they process personal data on our behalf, they are obliged as well to delete the data. So in a way, that is something I think that would respond to your question. But going back to data brokers, we don't really have that regulated, and Mark loves because we usually have some debates about this. It's, yeah, in California, it's even that requirement that you need to tell the person if you sell the data and so on. There is no such thing indeed in Europe because it's a bit trickier because of the data transfers and the whole chain of custody, perhaps, because you go from one processor to a sub-processor and so on, and at one point, if you're a big company, that chain gets lost.
One more question. Do you think there is a way to stop that chain, to break it? Because even if we request to remove that data, 24 hours after, someone else is going to start collecting it again. And it's just never ending. So can we stop data brokers from collecting that data so fast?
I don't think we can. That's my opinion. I don't know, Mark, what you say?
So data brokers are an interesting conundrum. They really are. And we look after a lot of clients, and they will undertake a marketing program. We've got this data from markpoveydata.com, and they've assured us that all of the data that they're supplying to us is absolutely consent-driven because it's cold marketing. We are marketing people we've never spoken to, we've never met, we've never exchanged business cards across the show floor. I challenge them. Well, how can you prove to me, what was your name, sorry? Yarek, how can you prove to me that Yarek gave me his consent for me to approach him and sell him my new Wonder fridge? You can't. So therefore, the consent argument fails at line 1. Their response to me has been when I've challenged them, well, you're only renting the data. What does that mean? You know, you can't rent something that can't be got hold of. So, as you've said, you know, you've done all that. I found out you're using my data. Please erase my data. And they come back again. So they relist it, rerun it, and all of a sudden they're selling. They're not selling fridges to you now. They're selling you microwaves.
Exactly. And we focus on security, protecting of the information.
Yeah.
People don't understand how important is privacy.
No, they don't.
With the amount of information data brokers collecting, if there is data breach, how bad is that? If they know everything about us, every second, every website, anything we open, they know everything. People just don't understand the privacy. So
No, and
security of the information, yes, that is important. Privacy, no one talks about that.
yeah, so the CCPA was an attempt at making privacy better for US, California citizens, and indeed the other versions of it throughout the US. And they softened it a little bit because obviously lobbying is very strong in the US. So please don't sell my data is about as far as it goes. So in Europe, you can do through various supervisory authorities, depending where you are, you can, what's called, as an individual, it's your data, you own it, it's not somebody else's. You can speak to the regional supervisory authority, say, I've got an issue with markpoveysdata.com. I believe they obtained my information incorrectly. I believe that they're processing my data illegitimately, and they will then investigate. So in the UK, we also have a law called the PECR, and that really focuses on marketing efforts. So they can be punished against other regulations. The GDPR and CCPA are not the only privacy regulations that there are. There are others that we have to consider as well. And that also, just to go back to what you said, is where sometimes it all falls apart. You know, you hear when you ring up, for GDPR, I can't give you that data. It may not have anything to do with GDPR. So you are allowed to voice your concerns, and the supervisor also should, especially if there's a lot of concerns raised, investigate. There have been data brokerage houses in the UK closed down for doing the very thing that you just described.
But that also, to come back to what you said about consent, indeed consent is, I think, a very legal concept for someone that works only in security.
Yeah.
Because you would have some conditions for consent to be considered valid under GDPR. So if you have a very good DPO and perhaps a very good data protection lawyer, when you have the privacy notice, so you inform people in the EU specifically that you will collect the data and you would send it to a data broker, that perhaps you are a data broker, you can indeed find some loopholes and mention that as a purpose and make that consent be lawful. So in a way, data brokerage can be, if you know exactly how to use the right words and the loopholes and everything, can be in a way lawful because there are no regulations and no prohibitions targeting that specifically. Thank you.
Does that help? Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, that's 12 o'clock.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.